That's great. Don't forget, you can continue the discussion on Q&A Extra. Tracy Holmes and a guest, Simon Longstaff, are taking talk back and discussing your social media comments and questions as soon as we finish. You'll find Q&A Extra on ABC News Radio and Facebook Live. Now, next Monday here on Q&A, the Attorney-General, George Brandis, the Deputy Opposition Leader, Tanya Plibersek, News Corp journalist and editor, Piers Ackerman, and British journalist Claire Wardell, the Research Director at First Draft, a new international media group targeting and exposing fake news. Until next week, good night.
They'll be busy.
Well, thank you very much to Tony Jones. Welcome to Q&A Extra here on ABC News Radio and streaming live on Facebook. I'm Tracy Holmes. We have a new guest each week, and in the studio with me today is Simon Longstaff from the Ethics Centre. Simon, welcome.
Thank you, Tracy.
And welcome to Q&A. So we're going to continue tonight's discussion with Q&A Extra right here on ABC News Radio. You can give us a call to discuss any of the issues that you heard tonight or anything else you'd like to discuss that is part of the national dialogue. The number to call is 1300 22 5576. That's 1300 22 5576. Or you can join us on the ABC News or the Q&A Facebook pages. Simon, we heard a lot of discussion tonight about trying to find somewhere back in the centre. The argument, democracy has become so divided. We're arguing the extremes. We saw examples of that tonight with disagreements on certain issues, and the dialogue goes that way. And I think it was Luca Belgiorno-Nettis, the founder of New Democracy Foundation, that says, when are we going to redefine democracy and bring it back to finding solutions? Is that at the heart of many of the issues that we're facing today?
Yeah, I think there are a couple of different levels that emerged during that debate. There was Luca's really fundamental point that democracy could be practiced in a different way. He's a champion for going back to what's called sortition, in which it's a random selection of citizens to make decisions on behalf of us all instead of having a parliament, and also the role of citizen juries. And that's perhaps a radical idea to some, although it's been used in the past at a different scale. But I think the other thing that was happening, and we saw it towards the end, was this discussion about the role of political parties and whether people need to commit to them on the long term. And that raises a pretty important thing that we all need to realise, and that is that individual political parties are private associations which are in a contest for public power. No doubt they're motivated by good intentions, many of them for the community. But there's a sense, I think, at large in Australia today that when political parties, whether they're large or small, enter into that contest, their interests are prevailing over those of the community as a whole. And lots of people are being overlooked. If you're in a marginal electorate, then you're listened to. If you're in a safe electorate, why bother? If you're in areas of the country where you become invisible to the political gaze, then perhaps even government doesn't notice you're there. And Jackie Lambie was talking, as a number of panellists were tonight, about what's happening in the community when you're forgotten by the political class. So I think there's a fundamental challenge for them as well as for the system as a whole. And for my part, I think optimistically we can get a better outcome than we're presently able to secure.
Okay, so the number to ring is 1300 22 5576. That's 1300 22 5576, and we're taking your calls now. Talk a little bit more about that and the point that, as you say, Jackie Lambie made about representing the people who put you there in the first place. Why does that seem so forgotten?
Well, I think our system is a very particular kind of system called representative democracy, unlike other systems, for example, in Europe, where you're elected and you go as a delegate of the people, where you basically do what they tell you to do. Our system's about choosing people who you believe to have sufficiently good judgment so that they can independently work out what the public interest happens to be. And that's why from time to time you'll see opinion polls saying lots of people want something to be done, and the politicians collectively will say, well, actually, looking at the larger picture, that's not in the national interest. Now, when that begins to break down, when you think that a politician is being driven, say, and this is Lambie's point, by the weight of political donations, or by just the raw pursuit of power, so that their principles start to be watered down and you don't really know what they stand for, when there is actually no evident reason for why you want power other than just to have power itself.
Which is what people are saying is happening in WA.
That's the narrative. And I think people say, well, if that's happening, then the whole system must be rotten. And what's so tragic about it is that whether you believe in parliamentary democracy or not, the parliament does not belong to the politicians. It doesn't belong to the private parties that contend for power. It's ours. And if you know anything about the history by which there were these terrible struggles, particularly during the Civil War in Britain in the 17th century, vast oceans of blood were shed by ordinary people to establish these institutions, not for the sake of the politicians. And if you live in an electorate or in a country or even in a global society where you start to feel that actually you don't really matter anymore, that you're just a bit of coal to be put into the furnace of the economy or a vote to be won, then you become deeply disillusioned. And I think we're starting to see this all around. A lot of these unusual results in the world are protests against the breakdown in trust in the system.
Okay, so the first caller tonight is Joe, who's calling from Victoria. Hi, Joe. What would you like to say?
Basically, that I really liked what Luca was saying and suggesting. I think that when we engage people's spirit some good ideas come out of left field, and I think you can get perspective from those that are being talked about by politicians, and you'll get us all sorting and working together better, I think, and being energised when there's hope of being able to participate. I think we'll take it all a bit more seriously, and we won't need to. Well, I get when I'm sort of just in community, I'm sick of people bagging politicians. I'm sick of people whining about what's not happening. I just wish that we could, just in our own little communities, sort of feel like we have a little bit of power. Not power, we're not after power, we're after sort of solving. Anyway.
Being part of the solution.
Being part of the solution, so I think it's going to be much more engaging. You get a broader variety of people in there, and I find in conversation with mixed bag of people that, as I said, unusual things come from most unexpected people.
All right. Thank you for that, Joe. All right. Appreciate your call. And I think that's a really important fact, isn't there, that in hope and being positive and feeling like you're part of a solution, there's great energy in that, and probably some of the energy that we've seen missing. The energy has been so heated because it's been inflammatory.
Yeah, look, I think Joe made some really interesting and important points. Firstly, we shouldn't underestimate the power of the crowd to discover really good answers to difficult questions. There's been evidence mounting for a long time about that. But I think also what Joe was saying, there's a more interesting possibility in all of this too. And that is that if it's true that the world we're moving into is one in which there is less employment, at least of the traditional kind, than there has been, and this will be across all sectors of the economy, people in the professions, in other areas too, because robots and expert systems will do things in a far more efficient and effective way at lower cost, then we may actually have to redefine how we think about what makes us have meaning in our lives. And if it's not by having a job and paid employment, it may very, very well be because we become excellent citizens. The sort of thing that Luca's talking about, in which you harness that capacity and the kind of hope that Joe's been talking about, is a real way in which you could see something driven not so much just by the political concerns, but also by economic and structural changes. And there's a fascinating possibility in that, which I think we're yet properly to explore.
All right, just repeating the number, 1300 22 5576. Let's head to Reese now, who's calling from Cairns. Hi, Reese.
Hi, mate. How you going?
Very good, thanks.
So I heard tonight about the, I think it was the ancient Greek version of members of the community being randomly selected to become a part of the government. Mm-hmm. And I don't think that that would be adequate because, yeah. But anyway, I think that maybe possibly the government should be paid less and have less entitlements. And that way only those that are most passionate about their community and about making a change in Australia are the ones that remain in that profession.
Reece, I really understand the point you're making, and a lot of people make the same point, but I think when you consider, this isn't discussed a lot, is it? They might not be doing a great job in the way that we would like them to do, but the number of hours they work, our politicians work very hard, don't they? Where do you sit on this?
Well,
Simon?
I think thanks for that, Reece, and I understand entirely why you're putting that view. I think there's one thing beyond what Tracy's saying. It's not just that they work hard, because they do, and it's a pretty thankless task given the way that most of us feel about them.
And they could be thanked more if they probably listen more.
But that's probably not the major point. Yeah. One of the troubles that used to exist before they raised politicians' pay to the level it is at the moment is that it tended only to be the case that the wealthier people could afford to make that choice to go into politics. If you came from reasonably modest means, you really couldn't afford it unless and sustain a large family and things like that. So I'm not saying the balance is right, Reece. I think you're right to raise the question, but we need to balance a couple of different principles here. What's fair remuneration for the hours? What ensures that a person can go into Parliament irrespective of their means? And how do we do that in a way that doesn't have people there just because they're gaining a seat and because of employment, but as you rightly say, and I think this is the core point you make, that they have a passionate concern about some idea of what makes for a good society, which motivates them to go into Parliament and then to stay there for as long as they can. And I think that's actually where a lot of them start.
It is where they start, and that's why we vote for them.
But sometimes in that party system, particularly when they're really strictly corralled, sadly enough, a lot of that's lost.
All right, plenty of calls coming through on 1300 22 5576. We're going to Peter next, who's calling from Erskineville in New South Wales. Hi, Peter.
Hi, how you going?
Good, thanks. What would you like to say?
Well, I just want to make a comment that I was really interested in when Yasmin was having, just before the big slanging match, when she was about to say something about Sharia law, when she called, geez, I have a brain snap. Jackie Lambie out on it, yes, and said, but you don't know what it's about. And I thought it was really interesting that they were actually about to have a discussion about what it actually does mean. What if, I just had an idea, that what if there's a whole moderate Muslim world out there that we're not connecting with, and are we not promoting extremism, how do I put this, but are we just looking at a small cohort that are extremists to Muslims as well, and unfortunately maybe alienating people that would actually work with us as a community?
That's a really good point you make, Peter, and one of those little-known facts is that we overlook over and over again is that most people who have been most affected by terrorism, by the Islamic State style of terrorism, are Muslims themselves.
Oh, overwhelmingly.
Overwhelmingly.
Massive numbers. But I think, Peter, you're right. I mean, I don't know as much as I probably should about Islam and in fact probably about lots of religions which inform people's lives. But there are a couple of things worth noting in this debate. Firstly, I'll declare I believe in a secular society in which everybody stands equal before the law. I don't think religions themselves should be informing particularly the nature of the law, but we shouldn't be naive about the complexity of this that goes well beyond the world of Muslims. Halakhic law amongst the Jewish people exists and is practiced by many people. They have their own courts, the Beth Din, which rule on issues, things like divorce and things separately to the way in which the law operates. Christianity, we take it for granted now that certain Christian faiths will assert the sanctity of the confessional. And the law recognises this up to a certain point, but if it didn't, there would be priests as a matter of conscience who would refuse to disclose. Now, this is a world in which other religions also have legal systems well established which they apply in practice, but it doesn't bring up the same scope of concern as currently arises in relation to the Muslim community in Australia. And I thought the most interesting thing that I learnt today from Yasmin before she was cut off when she was talking about Sharia law was she said, well, Sharia law says you are obliged to uphold the laws of the country in which you live. Now, if that was known and if that was typically what people within Islam believed, and I take it that she knows her own faith, that's a big difference to what I think a lot of people think, including perhaps Jackie Lambie, who I think she suspects that there's a separate law which is supposed to take priority over the operation of the law. But for me, I know that Europe had hundreds of years of bloodshed between Protestants and Catholics over an interpretation by God. We saw it go through into Ireland, and it was only ultimately settled when the secular ideal was put in place, where it said, OK, you may disagree about these within the privacy of your home, but it is not to affect the way in which our liberal democratic societies operate. And as far as the rule of law goes, we're all equal before the same law. And to the extent that we do that and are even-handed in our approach to other religions, whether it's Muslims or the Jewish people or the Christians or the Baha'i or anybody else, then I think we could probably work to a much more sensible outcome.
Thanks very much for your call, Peter. Plenty of other callers coming through. I'm Tracy Holmes. He's Simon Longstaff from the Ethics Centre, and this is Q&A Extra on ABC News Radio and streaming live on Facebook. Let's now head to Martin from Melbourne. Martin, good evening.
Hi, Tracy. How are you going?
Very good, thanks.
That's good. I loved Q&A tonight, and I was just listening to Simon describe some religious aspects of what he just said, and that's what Yasmin said about the law that we or they or us stand on, and or the country we live in is bound by the way we live. I'm a past security person from Manus Island, and the intent of what people are coming over to Australia for is to actually escape those standings that Yasmin was talking about. And it's an incredible standing to actually hear what these people are saying. And to listen to Yasmin tonight was, I think, a breath of fresh air. She's an extremely well-educated, well-versed person, and I think that a lot of us should be actually listen to her. I mean, I know Jackie, cut in there a bit and sort of raise the issue. When you look at Muslims and you talk about Islam and the religion, Simon, I'm sure you would be able to tell me, or if not the listeners, that there is not so many different aspects between religion to religion. So I'm really keen to hear what you've got to say about Christianity and Islam and other religions that drive us as a world aspect. And yeah, Simon, I think I'd really enjoy your spiel on it. So what have you got to say about those, the entirety of religion in this world, I suppose?
Well, I'm not a theologian, Martin, but I'll give it a go. There are three religions which all claim to be religions of the book. The oldest of these is Judaism, followed by Christianity and then Islam. And they all go back to a story around Abraham and an Old Testament. So there's lots of things which they share in common, but equally they all make absolute and contradictory claims as to what the truth ultimately is. So you'll find that Islam makes its claim in relation to the Prophet Muhammad, that he's the last of the prophets and that the Quran is the word of God. And it contradicts certain things which are said in Christianity, which contradicts certain things in Judaism. And because they don't say this is just a version of the truth, they say this is the truth, then it creates the seeds for conflict. Equally, religions, even amongst those, can be divided into different sects. So there's a difference between the Sunni part of Islam and the Shia side, and then there are subsets within that, just as there is between Roman Catholicism and the different Protestant branches, and there's the Orthodox and the Progressive within Judaism, and again, various groups there. And that's only touching those three religions without then going into Buddhism and Jainism, and I could go on and on. There's so many different. The trouble arises when any of them bump into each other, where they make these absolute claims, and when people think that they have to defend these things to the death, to their own death and to the death of others, because which
is an extreme version of all of them. It's not anywhere near the majority.
No, and that's where we see the extremes, and it's those minorities that take that view in any religion. It's like almost any form of fundamentalism or totalitarianism. When it has this, it can set people up. Now, the vast majority of people don't, in fact, occupy that space. And another point that Yasmin made tonight was to try and get us to think a little bit differently between what their religion might teach and what the culture of a country might be. I mean, there are lots of Christians in Australia who are distinctly different because we're Australians than, say, the Poms. They're cultural differences. And there's just as there's a difference between the Irish and the Scots and the English. And we'd see this between us and New Zealand and America. So culture overlaid on top of religion, all I ever see when I'm looking at people is the manifest example of it. One little thing, whenever the Queen goes to see the Pope in Rome, she has to be dressed fully in black from head to toe, and the only part of her face, even wearing a veil, that's revealed is the face itself and things like that. And we think, gosh, covering from head to toe in black, that must be a Muslim thing. That's the convention, which is still practiced to this very day.
And nuns. We still see nuns walking around the same
but it's
thing.
a cultural thing. It's not to say that the religion's setting out to oppress women or not. I mean, people have different views about that. So it's incredibly complicated, Martin. I can't pretend to unpack it all here, except to say that I think the vast majority of people, certainly living in a country like Australia, recognise that secular ideal which keeps us safe from the extremes. And as long as we have that with the rule of law where we all stand equal before it, then I think there's a way to navigate through these things. Martin,
really appreciate your call to Q&A Extra here on ABC News Radio and streaming live on Facebook. Let's go to our next caller, and it is Kate from Melbourne. Hi, Kate.
Hello.
What would you like to say?
Thank you so much. It was such an interesting discussion tonight. I have two questions. The first is probably refers to an earlier discussion that you guys were having regarding the global citizen and the citizenry being involved as a player in the parliament. I think the concern I have with that idea is that it harps back to ideas of the old concept of democracy, but a romanticised concept of democracy. If we think about the Greek tragedy or the Greek experience of democracy, those people who engage in the democratic process were very learned people of particular standing. They had the time and the experience and the knowledge and the intelligence to analyse these issues and come to a decision. They were also all men who happened to have, financial standing to be able to do it. So extrapolating from that, I wonder if we're putting too much on the current citizens, or that we should expect more from modern citizens, that they need to engage more with the news, that they need to be more analytical, that if they don't understand a religion like Islam, to go out and research on their own and analyse the information and come to conclusions based on research and rationality.
Kate,
yes?
Let me put that back on you.
Yes.
Where do you stand? Like if somebody said to you, would you like to come along and be part of this citizen democracy and making decisions on policy issues? What would you do?
I think I'm a terrible example because I'm actually a politics student, if you can tell by the question. So I always found it frustrating. I'm not born in Australia, but I had to kind of explain to people that we were from a Westminster system, that we had two houses of parliament, that the pomp and ceremony related to this thing and this thing. And I was the kid in school that was really annoying in the Canberra trip that used to tell everybody what was going on from each state. So the worst example to give that question.
Brandishing your copy of the Constitution.
But I do have one. I'm staring at it now with the Human Rights Act. I'm a total cliche. So that's my question. Is that concept really based on some flawed ideas? And maybe we can extrapolate from that and go to that discussion you were having about really putting the onus on the individual and saying, you really need to do the research here. You need to think about things and be engaged.
Look, it's a great question. The first thing is that we do have a tendency to try and romanticise the past and to think that there must have been some golden age where everything was perfect. Of course, it was never like that. The system that Luca was talking about in places like ancient Athens, it was a bit broader than you suggest. It didn't mean that you had to be an expert or in the leisured class to be chosen from that group to sit within their group of 500 legislators. All sorts of people did it, people like Socrates, who obviously was one of the greatest philosophers that ever lived, but also people who were shoemakers and things like that could do it. But there were deficiencies. There were deficiencies in terms of the franchise, so it didn't include women. There were deficiencies in terms of the society being based on slave labour. And all those things that were wrong, though, don't mean that we have to replicate everything that was there. I think Luca's point is that perhaps there's an idea in that of the citizen playing a more active role in deliberation and decision making than is currently working just within our own parliamentary democracy. But the thing I really think important about what you've been raising here, Kate, is to do with the quality of the consent that we give as citizens, whether we're voting in an election under the current system or participating in some other democratic process. Because the whole idea of democracy is that when we consent to be governed, because all of the authority that these politicians exercise in a democracy come from us, those who are governed. When we give our consent, it must be of a certain quality, which is why it's such an absolute sin within democracy to lie to the people, to mislead them during an election. So there's an obligation on the politicians to be truthful, to stick to what they say and not to misrepresent their positions. Equally, there's an obligation on us to become interested in the kind of society that we want to build, to find out the facts of circumstances. Like there's a big debate about climate change and things like that. Somewhere in there are some facts to be known, and we can better inform ourselves about these things so that we're not just being blown from the strongest wind from one side to the other.
Is part of the problem, Simon, that we've almost given up to some extent. We expect our politicians to be speaking as though we're there for them rather than vice versa, and we've lost a lot of hope. We've lost a lot of interest in what they do, because what we see day in, day out is probably not all that attractive.
Look, in the state in which I live, in New South Wales, the politicians in this state almost destroyed the legitimacy of the parliament by the way that they carried on both sides of politics for a period of time. And people have disengaged. The truth is, when I'm out in various parts of Australia, you know, in the bush and in the cities, lots of people just don't care. I mean, not everybody like Kate is studying politics and loves the Constitution and the Human Rights Act and things like that. There are plenty of people who say, look, I can't be bothered with what these people are doing. I'm just going to get on with my life and I'm going to do the things which I need to do in order to flourish. And there's something wonderful about that too, that self-reliance. I just think that we should have shortchanged ourselves a bit by allowing that to happen. If anybody can reclaim the quality of our democracy, it's us, the citizens.
Right.
And I think that's probably the golden thread that runs through Luca's comments, Kate's comments and a few of the others we've heard tonight.
Our next caller is from Gippsland. Frank. Good evening, Frank.
Oh, good evening. Look, I'm really ringing. Is part of our problem the people that we pre-select? I mean, in the last 12 months, we've had 2 senators that have been bankrupts that probably shouldn't have ever been in the first place. And now we have a Conservative that decides he doesn't want to be in a Conservative party anymore. He wants to start his own party. Well, he didn't get elected by people to start his own party. He got elected on the Liberal ticket. And if he was unhappy with that, he shouldn't have run in the first place.
Yeah, look, Frank, I thought you were going to say something else, actually. When you said about the pre-selection, I thought you were going to have a go at, because I think this is an issue. People have just been union officials or they've been ministerial staffers and haven't had a lot of experience of life outside of the political class. And that's
that is true.
Yeah, so sorry, I don't mean to put words in your mouth, Frank, but I think that's an issue. Look, you've also seen political parties responding to these things, and of course I think Senator Bernardi's got a very large question of conscience to resolve for the reason you've asked, in that it is only 7 months ago. And to be honest, look, I think I'd distinguish between people who get sacked by their own party. I mean, if a party chooses to kick someone out, then they have to live with the consequences. But where you freely choose to leave a party, where people thought that's what you were being elected to do, I think then the honourable thing to do is to stand down and put yourself forward again freshly to the people under your true colours. That's much easier, of course, in the House of Representatives than the Senate, where I think Senator Bernardi has 5.5 years or something to go, having stood as a Liberal but as something else. But I think a really courageous politician would make that choice and say, at the first opportunity, I'll stand before the people under my declared colours, my true colours.
This is Q&A Extra on ABC News Radio with Simon Longstaff from the Ethics Centre and Tracy Holmes with you. Let's head to Jack at Campbelltown. Hello, Jack.
Oh, hi, Tracy.
Hi, yes.
Interesting discussion. Now, look, I just want to make that briefly. I mean, democracy, I don't see no much democracy. There's all these parties are basically have the same believe in the same platform, so there is hardly any choice for us. And I think when they are in power, they have too much power. They can, for example, make decisions, go to war, and like having a war against the Muslims now and all these things. But let's talk about the Muslims or any other group. They all have to obey to the law in whatever country they live in. So what are the Australian peoples worried about? Are they worried about that the Muslims suddenly get elected, to government and this country will be a Muslim country? I mean, this is also totally ridiculous.
Well,
go ahead, Simon.
Well, I think people are often... Look, I think what happens in lots of societies when you're under pressure, and a lot of people are under pressure at the moment in Australian society. They're worried about their jobs, whether their kids can afford to buy a house. There's lots of reasons why people are uneasy. It tends to make you far more sensitive to any claim about another group that's either getting special privileges or is against the spirit of the country in which you're living. And so it's easy for a certain style of politician who wants to gain power by dividing people to exploit those vulnerabilities within the community. In fact, it's a really interesting division between two styles of politics. There's an easy form of politics which tends to prevail when you say, well, I'll find a common enemy and we'll make ourselves feel better by finding somebody who's different to us and other than us. And we've seen many periods in history when that's been done, usually for the worse. And then there's a more difficult kind of politics which is inclusive, which tries to put forward a compelling common vision which unites people. Now, it takes a really skilled politician to do this. But what it does is when you bring people together around those ideas, then countries, societies tend to flourish. Last point, Jack, I think actually we're now seeing, because of the splintering that's taking place within the electorate, that there are genuine ideological differences. During the panel tonight was trying to list a few things on One Nation's view of economics and society. They're completely different, as far as I know, to the Labor Party, the Liberal Party, the National Party, Xenophon's group, Jackie Lambie's. I mean, there is a real choice now, and I think people are starting to explore those things, but perhaps not because they're compelled by the positive vision that's being offered so much as being deeply rattled by the failure of the system as it is at the moment.
Jack, thanks so much for your call. Look, there are lots of calls still to get through. I'm just letting you know now we're not going to get to all of them. We're trying to get through as many as we can. And also thank you to all of those on Twitter and Facebook for all of your comments. Plenty of people following what you've got to say there. Let's head to Jim at Parramatta. Hello, Jim. No, Jim's disappeared. Okay, why don't we go back to Jack? We've had Jack. Why don't we head to Stephen on 5081. Stephen, hello.
Yes, hello. Good evening.
Good evening.
It's great.
Thank you.
I think you stole some of my thunder there, Simon. But
sorry, Stephen.
No, that's all right. No, look, you're talking. I think the electorate's very disillusioned with the government and the process. I think the electorate's been looking for some sort of direction for a vision from government since 2007. And I don't think it's been happening, and I think they're all very frustrated out here, and they're very scared about jobs. And Malcolm Turnbull started off well with the articulating a vision, but he hasn't really carried anything out. And I think Kate Ellis hit the nail on the head, summing him up. And I mean, I remember Malcolm was on Q&A just before the election, and a lady from the audience asked him, what do you stand for now? And he came back with, well, I've been in public life 30 years, you know what I stand for. But I think we're all disillusioned. What does he stand for now? We're confused.
Look, I think you'd probably almost pick any politician at the moment and say, what do they stand for? And you'd get a very diverse range of answers depending on who you talk to. I mean, Stephen's point, though, about how the electorate's feeling, I don't think... it is about people being afraid about the loss of jobs and the housing situation. I think it's a deeper thing too. I think, I might be wrong about this, I think that the electorate's feeling that it doesn't matter, that people don't matter anymore. Their intrinsic worth has been forgotten by businesses, by politicians. I mentioned it before, the image I have is that people feel like they're just like one of these now infamous blocks of coal that you get shoveled into the furnace of the economy, or a vote to be harvested in an election, that you're just a tool for other...
Or if you're lucky, taken into Parliament as the show and tell.
Possibly, but either way, I think people in the country, and probably in many other countries in the world too, are feeling they're just a tool to be manipulated by others for their own interests. Now, as long as that stays, I think the uncertainty and some of the bitterness in politics will exist.
You've been listening to Q&A Extra here on ABC News Radio and streaming live on Facebook. We hope to have your company again next week. We'll be taking more calls then, right after the televising of Q&A on ABC TV. Simon Longstaff from the Ethics Centre, thank you so much for being our guest this week.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
And thank you for your company. Thank you for the tweets and for the Facebook messages. We'll see you again next week. Bye for now.